Welcome back to the podcast, Catch It, A New Perception. My name is Ketuk. And thinking about how my perception was so much different when I was younger, I think some of our perception is gifted to us in different ways. Some of my perception had to do with the time that I lived when I was a child. 50 years later, everything is different in the world. So someone who was 5 or 6 years old today is not going to have the same perception as someone who was 5 or 6, 50 years ago. And so it goes. You go back 2 generations before that to 100 years ago, and a 5 or 6 year old would have had an entirely different perception than they do today, or would have 50 years ago. And then there are certain things where our perception may still be the same. Is there a common thread of the perception of a 6-year-old that will run through generation after generation for 7 generations? Is there a common thread? I think about the misperceptions that I had, and some of the perceptions I had. Some of them weren't necessarily misperceptions. When I was young, the people I knew that got cancer died from cancer. There was no real hope even. There was no solution. It was basically a death sentence. And people I knew that said that they had cancer maybe had tried some things through what people would consider Western medicine with pharmaceuticals and in that realm. And they died. Some of them young. They died from cancer. And I was about 19 years old. I believe my parents were rather young. And my father would have been 39 years old. And he was giving me a ride home one day. And before he dropped me off, he told me that he had cancer. Now, what I heard him say, because of my perceptions or my misperceptions, what I heard my father say is that he was going to die. Because he told me that he had cancer. He probably told me what kind of cancer he had. He never told me he was going to die from it. That's what I heard. That's what I heard him say. Because up to this point in my life, I don't remember. Now, someone may be able to come into my life and remind me of someone that I knew of 5 years earlier that had cancer that had recovered from it. I don't have a recollection of that today. Everyone I knew had passed over and had returned to the spirit world who had ever gotten cancer. So that's what I heard him say, even though he had never said that. He never even implied that. And if he would have known of my misperceptions, he would have corrected them on the spot. I didn't look him in the eyes and tell him, "You're telling me you're going to die. It's just the feeling I got." It was the thoughts I had. The reason I felt that way was because of my thinking. My thinking was because of what I had seen prior to this. So this is my perception, and it's reality at the time. It is a huge misperception. And I think it's one of the biggest problems we have is we don't define the difference between our misperceptions and our perceptions and what is real. So at the time, my father goes through some surgeries to have the cancer removed. He goes into some surgeries for exploratory to find out how it is spread, if it's spread, where it's at. And those were some more dangerous than just removing the cancer itself. And he had recovered from it, and he lived for decades after that. He was 39 years old, and he lived into his mid-60s. So It's interesting to me today to look at this and realize what my perceptions were. I just mentioned how young my dad was. My parents were always very young. That's what I heard when I was in school. Oh, your mom and dad are young. Well, I've always believed that people are young. I remember my grandfather passed when I was kind of a wee one. I was in grade school, probably about 10 years old. My grandfather had passed from cancer. And everybody told me how young he was. He was 54 years old. And all I heard at that time was, how young. Wow, how young he is. And so I've always had this perception that somebody 20 years older than me is young. And then somebody in their early to mid 50s is young. So my perception, my entire life of age is different than some other people. Now, I have a friend of mine whose father was considerably older than him comparatively to my father. He was maybe closer to my grandfather's age even. I mean, he was considerably older than my father. And my friend, I remember when he was about to turn 30, and he acted as if he was so old that life was soon to be over, is kind of what he implied. His entire perception of age was different than mine. I didn't have those misperceptions that someone else had. On other episodes, I've talked a little bit about becoming an elder and how people perceive that and what is an elder and, at what point do you become an elder? And I mean, obviously, a 20-year-old having a new kid would be an elder to their child. I don't think that they're old. So these are all perceptions that were gifted as children, or misperceptions that were given. Could a 6-year-old today have the same misperceptions that I had about some type of illness or some type of disease or the way I was seeing cancer? Could they have that same misperception today or 100 years ago when the Spanish flu was around, and the way that a 6-year-old thought about that? Was that similar to the way that I saw cancer? Or at one point in my life, this AIDS epidemic, as it was called at the time, and what that looked like a death sentence, because people who got it died from it. Whether they were intravenous drug user, whether they were two-spirited, or whether they got a blood transfusion at the hospital, or casual sex with someone, and they ended up with it. It was a death sentence at one point. It's not. So the whole perception of any of these types of illnesses or viruses or whatever they may be, a disease, whatever it might be, our perception may ring true from one generation to the next, all the way through. It's possible that our perception will continue to do that. And then on the other hand, it could be entirely different. I have a grandson who's 6 years old. His perception of life could be entirely different than mine was 50 years ago. It's the beauty of who we are. It's about learning something about who we are, how our perception can change, how we can realize that they're misperceptions, the perception of what is old from a child's point of view. When I was believing that my parents were young, and I'm in early grade school, because that's what I'm being told. Everyone told me my parents were young. And then all of a sudden I'm graduating from high school, my parents still seem to be young. And then I'm having kids of my own, and my parents still seem to be young. And now I'm becoming an elder, and are my parents still young? Not really. They're not. So my perception has changed. My parents may not, obviously, not as young as they once were. An elder in their communities in many ways, which is a good thing in my world. I think we need to get connected to the elders. Sometimes people will say someone's out of touch. Maybe you should reach out and touch them, and then they would no longer be out of touch. Don't say it as it's a derogatory thing. They're out of touch. They don't understand. Reach out to them and help them to understand. Or maybe it's time for you to reach out to an elder so you understand. Maybe their perception is correct today. Realize that anything we have as a perception today is possibly a misperception, and you have just become more open-minded than you were yesterday or earlier today. You can become as open-minded as you need to be. Realize all about your perceptions and how they can change. How when they do change, you realize you had some misperceptions when you never would have believed that. I did not know that I had a misperception about what cancer was when I was a child. When I was a teenager, when I was becoming an adult, I still had the same belief I did 15 years earlier. I am learning that my perception can change. And if I believe that I have a certain perception about something, that it could be a misperception. And that is my greatest asset in learning how to have the perception that I'm going to need moving forward. That I can change, I can be different, I can change my perception, I can be wrong. I have the right to be wrong. And I know that I've misspoke in this podcast at times and different episodes. I don't mean to. I don't apologize for it. And the reason I say I don't apologize for it is because I can't go back and individually name each one of those things. I'll do my best moving forward to not misspeak to the very best of my ability. Looking forward to next time. Live in harmony with and use the bounty of the land to bring kindness to the world. Dok Shao, okay?